Tribal Stance was created by Dark Chaos using the RPG Maker 2003 engine, and is an ambitious project to create a strategy game with the engine in line with games like Age of Empires or StarCraft. But like many ambitious projects, it fails on so many levels. That's far easier for me to think of things it gets wrong than the things it manages to get right. Like many real-time strategy games, there isn't much of a plot to speak of in this game. Your goal is to simply turn your small town into a bustling, walled-in city that is economically and militarily powerful, so that you may teach your enemies an important lesson. That lesson being that
you will respect my authority!
As I stated previously, it's much easier to create a list of things this game got wrong than what it got right. In fact, the only positive I can throw at the game is that the appearance of your buildings and structures change over time as you increase their levels. In this game, it is possible to assign the task of acquiring resources to miserable little peons that never appear on screen. The catch is that by the time you can unlock this feature, which is tied into constructing the workshop, you're likely to have already mastered the art of collecting resources quickly and probably have maxed out your production. As such, you will gain very little from turning this feature on, beyond being able to march off the battle after creating a fresh wave of troops, and be secure in the knowledge that your peasants will have refilled your warehouse while you were away. Of course, that just nicely segues into my final piece of mixed criticism, which is the combat system itself. On one hand, the game allows you to create massive armies and send the better part of 300,000 soldiers in total against your enemies. On the other hand, the game lacks any means of showing you the battles, so you're just left to listen to rather generic battle sound effects while swords, spears, and axe icons appear on the screen. Tribal Stance doesn't even make it out of the gate before stumbling over its own feet. As I mentioned previously, it is possible to turn on an auto-collect feature later on in the game, but when you first start out, you're forced to send your warlord to pick up a few pieces of wood, iron, or clay at a time in order to begin the process of upgrading your warehouse and resource gathering facilities. Though the biggest issue here isn't that you can't assign this mundane and repetitive chore to underlings, but that you'll need to make an excess of 100 trips between the 3 resource collection points in order to upgrade your warehouse and resource gathering facilities to level 2. Thankfully, the game does begin to pick up the pace after this initial problem, but I imagine that spending 15 minutes gathering resources just to get all of your mines and wood cutting operations up to speed would be enough to make most people quit. Of course, if you stick with the game and work to upgrade your resource gathering facilities and headquarters a few times, you can then unlock the barracks, which is the key to gathering resources quickly in this game. In fact, this feature feels like it strips any sense of strategy out of this game, since your opening strategy won't be to rush your opponent or to prepare your defenses, but to bribe your forces even if they are non-existent, with food in order to begin the process of acquiring resources in massive quantities, such as 1,000,000 pieces of wood or iron and clay at the same time. This process works because you can also use the soldiers to acquire food, and they will always give you more food back than you put into the system. So you can basically farm for massive resources as much as you want at this point, with the only caveat being you'll want to max out your headquarters first, since this building controls the cost of all of your upgrades. So the higher its level, the cheaper the buildings and walls will be. Of course, the real horror of this game is discovered through this process, and that issue is the unwieldy nature of the various menus. These issues range from the game sending you back to the top of the list every time you cancel a selection or successfully upgrade a building. This becomes annoying since you'll usually be upgrading the same building multiple times, so working your way through the options on the list to get to the one you want can quickly become a time-consuming chore that is also needlessly tedious. The menus in this game really do need to be better designed in order to make the game move a bit faster. My best suggestion would be to allow for the player to buy multiple upgrades at the same time. That way they don't have to work their way through the entire menu to upgrade their warehouse 50 times. Another issue with the menu is that they never tell you what a building does once it is built. It wasn't until I was forced to upgrade the headquarters to level 30 that I began to realize its effect on the prices of all my other upgrades. The fact that the game doesn't tell you what the various buildings do is made even worse when you realize the save feature is tied into having a smithy, since the smithy acts as a save point for the player, but you wouldn't be aware of this because the game doesn't tell you. Another issue with the menu is that they never show you how many resources of any type you currently have at any given point in time. This would be a nice feature to have, since it's highly frustrating to be told you are short on the resources needed to perform a particular upgrade. Another frustrating note about this game is that it pushes you in the direction of conquering some of the neighboring villages in order to increase your own power and prestige, but neither of those villages is possible to upgrade since your starting resource limit is too low, so they just end up being left to sit and rot, since you can't actually do anything with them. And on an even more frustrating note, the game is prone to crashing if your rival shows up during certain circumstances. Obviously, this can be highly frustrating if you don't have a relatively recent save file, since you'll need to potentially repeat hours of work depending on how much had happened between your last save and when the game crashed. Graphically speaking, the game feels rather basic and dependent on the default assets of the 2003 engine, but my complaint isn't that the game is utilizing the default assets, but that the first town starts to become crowded as you do all of the upgrades. It almost feels cramped, and you're wondering why it has to be like that, because you're being blocked sometimes by objects in the foreground. On the music side of things, the game is just terrible. This isn't because the pieces themselves are terrible or difficult to listen to, but because the game doesn't know how to use them appropriately, so most of the tracks just feel utterly wasted. In fact, the favorite part of the soundtrack for me is when it stops looping for a little bit and there's just dead silence. Tribal Stance is an absolute mess of a game that is in desperate need of being overhauled if the developer wants to turn it into anything approaching fun. As it stands, I advise staying away from this game and maintaining your distance by pulling out a measuring stick if you have to. This game won't bring you any joy since it's too easy to overwhelm the computer if you know what you're doing, and far too boring and tedious if you don't.